So I want to talk a little bit about rules of exponents. I know probably most of you don't remember your rules of exponents. I did on the second page of these notes do a little cheat sheet to remind you of your rules of exponents. So just things to remember and the things that we're going to use. If I have a number to a power, you'd multiply these powers. Also, the reverse is true. So if I had I to the 6, well, I to the 6 is the same thing as I squared to the third power. Okay, because 2 times 3 is 6, so things to remember. Other things to remember, if you have a negative exponent, it sends your exponent into, or it sends your number into the denominator, like this one right here. So just little things to remember. So I'm going to go up here, and I'm actually going to be using some of those rules of exponent. So first off, I have my -1 squared here. Well, -1 squared is -1 times -1, which is 1. And we're actually going to use that fact as we simplify the rest of these, because I'm going to start from basic, more familiar, to unfamiliar ones. So you have to be really careful, though, when you're putting a negative number to an exponent in a calculator, because you may be using this. So if I do -1 squared and I put that into Desmos, it actually tells me that it's -1. And your calculator isn't wrong, it's just the way that you put it in was wrong. You need to remember that the negative is actually with the 1. Okay, so it's -1 squared. How you put it in the first way is that's actually -1 times +1 squared. That would be the top one. So just be careful with the way that you put it in the calculator. Anyhow, so this one right here, -1 to the third, is -1 times -1 times -1. So, but I use this. I know -1 squared. That's one -1 squared times a -1. I know -1 squared is 1. So my answer is -1 here. -1 to the fourth. Well, it's going to be -1 times -1 times -1 times -1. I have a pair here and a pair here. So I have, well, how many -1 squareds do I have? I have 2 of them. So that's the same thing as 1 squared, which is 1. I know -1 squared is 1. For this one, I have, it's -1 times -1 times -1 times -1 times -1. I have 2 pairs of -1 squareds. So I have 2 pairs of them times -1. I know -1 squared is 1. And so my answer is -1 here. This one, -1 times -1 times -1 times -1 times -1 times -1. I have 1, 2, 3 pairs of -1 squareds. So I have -1 squareds. Well, how many of them did I have? I have 3. Well, I know -1 squared is 1, so that's the same thing as 1 to the third power, which is 1. -1 to the seventh power, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So, and we're multiplying all of these. I have 1, 2, 3 pairs. So -1 squared. I have 3 pairs of those times -1. I know -1 squared is 1 to the third power, which is just plain old -1. Now, it's really not important if you really understood what was going on there. I just want to make sure that you, I just wanted to kind of reiterate that this 3 right here represents how many pairs of something that we know. In this case, we know -1 squared is 1. One of the other takeaways from this is -1 to an even power is 1. -1 to an odd power is -1. Okay, so those are 2 takeaways. So powers of I. So we're going to work on kind of the same principle. So this one right here, we worked on the principle that -1 squared was 1. In this case, we're going to be working on the principle that, well, I squared is actually the same thing as -1. Okay? So I have I to the first power. Well, I really can't do much with that. That's just going to be I. I know I squared is actually, by definition, -1. I cubed. Well, let's look at I cubed. I'm going to write it out. I times I times I. So that's actually I squared times I. What do I know I squared is equal to? Well, I squared is equal to -1, so this is the same thing as -1 times I, which is -1I, or negative I. I to the fourth. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's I squared times I squared. I have 2 I squareds. Well, I squared is -1, and -1 squared is just 1. So all I'm doing is I'm counting the number of pairs, changing it to a -1, and taking it to that power. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 1, 2 pairs of I squareds. So I have 2 pairs of I squareds. This is the number of pairs times I. That's going to be -1 squared times I, because I squared is equal to -1, which is just going to be 1I, or I. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, I have 3 pairs of I's, I squareds. So I have 3 pairs of I squareds. So I do I squared to however many pairs I have. I squared is -1 to the third power, which is -1. To the seventh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now before I do this, I can actually make a prediction. If you notice, all of the odd powers have I in their answer. So I know that I'm going to have an I in my answer somewhere. Now I just have to figure out how many pairs I have, because that's basically my remainder. So I have, well, how many pairs of I squareds? I have 3 pairs of I squareds plus an I to the side. Okay. I squared is -1 to the third power times I, which is going to be -1I, or -I. Last one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 pairs of I squareds. And do you see that that is key? So I squared, so how many I squareds do I have? I had 4 pairs. I know I squared is -1, and -1 to the fourth is 1. Okay, and so the whole key to this is finding out how many pairs of I's you have. Now this in the notes, and I'm hoping I have this fixed, should be a 65. So I just want to reiterate that I had to fix that. So I'm going to give you a procedure to figure it out. So the first thing you do is you figure out how many pairs. How do you figure out how many pairs you have, how many pairs of I squares you have? You take your exponent and you divide by 2. So 12 divided by 2 is 6. Okay, this right here is going to be your exponent to your I squared, or your -1. So what I'm going to do is I can actually rewrite I to the 12th. Well, I to the 12th is actually 6 pairs of I squared. I know I squared is -1. Okay, so that number always goes here. I squared is -1. -1 to an even power is going to be 1. Okay, now we're going to talk about ones with remainders. So I'm going to do 15 divided by 2 to figure out my number of sides. Now I end up with a 7.5. We kind of had that observation already. When you have a remainder, that means that there is going to be an I in your answer. That's the only thing you have to do, is if you have a 0.5, when you divide by 2, you know that there's going to be an I in your answer. And so this is going to be I squared, or if you want to go straight to the -1 to the 7th power, that's always going to be your exponent. This is going to be, well, I squared is -1 to the 7th power times I, which is going to be -1 times I, which is -I. So either of those are good answers. I to the 65th power. So I take my 65, I divide by 2. That's going to be 32.5. My 0.5 here tells me that I'm going to have I in my answer. So this is going to be I squared to the 32nd power. Now you can actually skip the step of writing I squared. You can go straight to, well, I'm going to write -1 to whatever my power is when I divided. Okay, and so -1 to the 32nd power is 1I, or just plain I. Last one is our 402. 402 divided by 2 is equal to 201. I have no remainder, so I know I'm not going to have any i's in my answer. And so that's just going to be negative 1 to the 201, or I squared. I'm just going to go straight to the 201. I know a negative to an odd power, or negative 1 to an odd power, is just going to be negative 1. Okay, so I'm just going to do a few practice problems that are kind of reflective of the homework. You can skip these if you want to. If you want to go straight to the homework, that's fine. I just thought these were good. So for this one right here, this one's a little bit trickier because I have a negative on the outside. So I'm going to actually write this as negative 1 times I to the 11th. Okay, so in my final answer, I'm just going to remember that there's a negative 1 here. I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to take the 11, divide by 2, and I have 5.5. Okay, I know that there's a 0.5 here, so I know that there's going to also be an I in my answer. Okay, and then my other thing is my 5 here, well, that's going to be my negative 1 to the 5th power. So I'm going to rewrite this. I have my negative 1 times I. Negative 1 to the 5th power is actually just negative 1. I multiply my negative 1 and my negative 1, and I end up with I as an answer. This one's a little bit trickier. For this one right here, the first thing I'm going to do if I have a negative exponent is I just change it into a fraction, and my exponent becomes positive. So this is going to be I to the positive 101. Okay, and my procedures aren't going to change. So I take the 101, I divide by 2, that's going to be 50.5. So actually, I'm not going to make this 101. I'm going to make this 100. Sorry, I did not mean to make this 101. This should have been 100. 100. So divide by 2 is 50. So this is going to be 1 over negative 1 to the 50th, which is 1 over 1, which is just plain 1. Okay. Now we're going to go through and kind of look at our rules of exponents. So I'm going to actually rewrite this. So the first thing I'm going to do with these type of problems is I'm going to multiply my numbers. So this is going to be 4 times 7 times I, or 4 times 7. 4 times 7 times I, which is going to be 28 I squared. I know I squared is equal to negative 1. So that's going to be 28 times negative 1, which is negative 28. For this one, I separate it. I put all of my numbers together. So this is going to be negative 4 times 2 times negative 9 times I times I times I. Okay, that's going to be 4 times negative 4 times negative 9 is negative 30, or 36. 36 times 2 is 72 I cubed. Okay, so I multiply it out, and then I simplify this. This right here is going to be 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. So this is going to be 72 times negative 1 to the first times I, because remember that's going to be your exponent, and the 0.5 is where the I came from. And so my answer is just